No bride survived 7 days with the half-Apache rancher, until Ruth refused to leave. In a small, dusty town at the edge of the frontier, people spoke in low voices whenever the name Elias Crow was mentioned. Some said he was quiet, others said he was strange, but almost everyone agreed on one thing: no bride ever stayed with him for more than 7 days. No one knew the full truth, or maybe they did, but no one wanted to say it out loud. Elias lived far from town, on a wide, lonely ranch surrounded by open land and silent hills. He worked hard, spoke little, and came into town only when necessary. His dark eyes always seemed to be watching something far away, something no one else could see. When news spread that he was looking for a wife again, people shook their heads. "Another one won't last," an old woman said. "They never do," someone replied. That was when Ruth Callahan arrived. Ruth was not like the others. She didn't come from the town, and she didn't care much for its whispers. She had traveled far, leaving behind a life that no longer existed. Her family farm had failed after years of drought, and there was nothing left for her there. She wasn't looking for love. She was looking for a place to begin again. So when she heard about Elias Crow and his offer, a marriage in exchange for a home and a shared life, she didn't laugh like the others. She listened. "You should stay away from him," a shopkeeper warned her. "Why?" Ruth asked calmly. The man hesitated. "Because no woman stays." Ruth tilted her head slightly. That's not really an answer. But no one gave her a better one. A few days later, she stood outside the small town office, where Elias had come to meet her. He looked exactly like people had described: tall, quiet, with a serious face and eyes that didn't show much. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Elias said, "You understand the arrangement?" Ruth nodded. "I do." "And the history?" he added carefully. "I've heard the stories," she said, "but stories don't always mean truth." Elias studied her for a long moment, as if trying to understand something about her. Finally, he said, "The ranch is a long ride from here." "That's fine," Ruth replied. And just like that, their journey began. The ranch was even more isolated than Ruth had imagined. It sat under a wide sky, with nothing but land stretching in every direction. The house was large but quiet, almost too quiet, as if it had been waiting for something, or someone, for a long time. Elias showed her around without saying much. "This is the kitchen," he said. Ruth nodded. "That's the storage room." Another nod. When they reached a door at the end of the hallway, Elias paused for a moment. "That room stays closed," he said simply. Ruth glanced at the door but didn't ask questions. "All right." Something about the house felt unfinished. Not broken, but empty. There were chairs, tables, and all the things a home should have. But no warmth, no feeling of life. That evening, Elias prepared a simple meal. They sat across from each other, the silence between them heavy but not uncomfortable. "You don't talk much," Ruth said after a while. Elias looked up briefly. "There's not always something to say." Ruth gave a small smile. "Maybe. Or maybe people just stopped trying." Elias didn't respond, but something in his expression shifted slightly. That night, Ruth lay in bed, listening to the soft wind outside. The house made quiet sounds, creaks and whispers that came with age. She wasn't afraid, but she was curious. The next morning, she woke early and stepped outside. The land was beautiful in a quiet way. The rising sun painted everything in soft gold, and for the first time in a long while, Ruth felt a small sense of peace. She decided she would not spend her time worrying about rumors. Instead, she would observe. Over the next few days, Ruth began to notice small things. Elias worked from sunrise to sunset, but he never asked her to help. He kept his distance, as if he expected her to leave at any moment. Meals were simple, conversations were short, and yet Nothing about him felt unkind. If anything, it felt like he was holding something back. On the third day, while cleaning one of the shelves, Ruth found something hidden behind a stack of old books. It was a small journal. The cover was worn, and the pages inside were filled with careful handwriting. Ruth hesitated for a moment, then opened it. The first few entries were normal, daily thoughts, small observations. But as she turned the pages, the tone began to change. The writer spoke of confusion, of distance, of feeling like a stranger in her own home. Ruth's eyes moved quickly down the page. Then she reached the final entry. Day 6. I don't think I can stay. It's not him. It's something I can't explain. Ruth slowly closed the journal. The room felt quieter than before. She looked toward the hallway, toward the closed door at the end. And for the first time since arriving, Ruth felt something new. Not fear, but a deep, growing question. Ruth did not tell Elias about the journal. Instead, she kept it hidden under her pillow, like a quiet secret waiting to be understood. She read it again that night, slowly this time. The words felt heavier now. The woman who had written it did not sound afraid of Elias. She sounded unsure. That made Ruth think. The next morning, Ruth watched Elias more carefully. He moved through the ranch with the same quiet focus as before. He fixed fences, checked the animals, and worked without rest. But there was something else now, something Ruth had not noticed before. He never stayed in one place too long. He never lingered. Even during meals, he seemed ready to leave the table at any moment, as if he did not expect company to last. Ruth decided to test something. You wake up early every day, she said casually while pouring water. Elias nodded. Work starts early. You always work alone? That's how it's been. Ruth tilted her head. That's how you prefer it? Elias paused for a second. It was a very small pause, but Ruth noticed. It's what I'm used to, he said. That was not the same answer. Later that day, Ruth began helping around the ranch without asking. She cleaned the kitchen more carefully. She organized the storage room. She even tried to fix a loose fence near the edge of the land. Elias noticed. You don't have to do that, he said when he saw her working. I know, Ruth replied simply, but I can. Elias looked at her for a moment, then gave a small nod. He did not stop her. By the fourth day, something had changed. The house still felt quiet, but not as empty. Ruth had opened the windows, letting in fresh air and light. She hummed softly while working, bringing a small sense of life into the rooms. Elias did not say anything about it, but he stayed at the table a little longer during meals. That evening, Ruth opened the journal again. She flipped through the pages, searching for patterns, and she found them. Each bride had written almost the same things. At first, they were hopeful, then confused, then distant, and by day 6, they all wrote about leaving. Not because of something Elias did, but because they felt like they didn't belong. Ruth frowned. That doesn't make sense, she whispered to herself. She closed the journal and looked toward the hallway again. The closed door stood at the end, silent and still. On the 5th day, Ruth decided to go into town. Elias didn't ask why. He only said, "Be back before dark." Ruth rode into town under the hot afternoon sun. The moment people saw her, the whispers began again. She's still here. It's already day 5. She won't last. Ruth walked into the general store, calm as always. The shopkeeper looked surprised. You're still at the ranch? Yes, Ruth said. Why wouldn't I be? The man hesitated. They all stay at first. It's the last days that matter. Ruth crossed her arms. What happens on the last days? No one answered. A woman nearby finally spoke, her voice low. They leave because they feel something is wrong. What kind of wrong? Ruth asked. The woman shook her head. Not danger, just emptiness. Ruth's eyes narrowed slightly. That word again. As Ruth rode back to the ranch, her thoughts were clear. This was not a story about fear. It was a story about distance. When she arrived, Elias was sitting outside, watching the sunset. That was new. He usually stayed busy until the last light was gone. "You went to town," he said without looking at her. "Yes." "What did they say?" Ruth stepped closer. "The same thing they always say." Elias nodded slowly, as if he expected nothing more. Ruth studied him. "You don't seem surprised," she added. "I'm not," he replied. "Because it's true?" she asked. Elias finally looked at her. His expression was calm, but there was something deeper in his eyes. "You'll understand," he said quietly. Ruth held his gaze. "Understand what?" Elias stood up. "Before the seventh sunrise," he said, "you'll know why they left." Then he walked away. That night, Ruth could not sleep easily. His words stayed with her. "You'll understand." It sounded less like a warning and more like certainty, as if he already knew how this would end. On the sixth morning, Ruth woke up with a strange feeling. The ranch looked the same. The sky was clear. The air was calm. But something felt different. Elias was already awake. He was packing supplies near the barn, food, water, tools. Ruth watched him from a distance. "Going somewhere?" she asked. Elias didn't look at her. "Just preparing." "For what?" Ruth asked. There was a pause. Then he said, "In case you decide to leave." Ruth felt a small spark of frustration. "You're already expecting it," she said. Elias finally turned to her. "They all leave," he said simply. Ruth took a step closer. "I'm not they," she said firmly. Elias didn't argue, but he didn't agree either. As the day passed, the silence between them grew heavier. Not cold, not angry, just full of something unspoken. Ruth could feel it now, the same thing the others had written about. Not fear, not danger, but a strange sense of being kept at a distance, as if no matter how close she stood, she was still outside something. That evening, Ruth stood in the hallway. The closed door was right in front of her. She stared at it for a long moment. Then slowly, she reached out her hand. But before she could touch the handle, she heard Elias's voice behind her. "That room won't give you answers," he said quietly. Ruth turned to face him. "Then what will?" she asked. Elias looked at her with a calm, steady expression. "Tomorrow," he said. Ruth did not move. Tomorrow, the seventh day, the day every bride left. But Ruth was not afraid. This time, she was ready. The sixth day ended slowly. The sky turned soft orange, then deep blue. The ranch was quiet, just like always. But tonight the silence felt heavier, like something important was waiting to be said. Ruth stood outside, looking across the wide land. She could feel it now, the same feeling the others had written about. Not fear, not danger, but distance. A quiet wall that could not be seen, but could be felt. Elias was sitting near the barn, fixing a small tool. His hands worked carefully, but his mind seemed far away. Ruth walked toward him. "We need to talk," she said. Elias didn't look up right away. "We've talked." "No," Ruth said gently. "We've spoken. That's not the same." Elias stopped working. That small pause again. Ruth had learned to notice it. She sat down a few steps away from him. "Why do you expect me to leave?" she asked. Elias placed the tool beside him. "Because they always do," he answered. "That's not a reason," Ruth said. "It is for me," he replied quietly. Ruth studied his face. There was no anger there, no coldness, just certainty, and something else, something like tiredness. You don't chase them away, Ruth said slowly, but you don't let them stay either. Elias looked at her now. For the first time, his calm expression shifted. Ruth continued, her voice steady. You keep your distance. You don't share your thoughts. You don't open your life. You treat them like guests who will leave, so they do. Elias didn't interrupt, but his eyes did not move away from hers. They didn't leave because of something scary, Ruth added. They left because they felt alone, even while standing right next to you. The words hung in the air. Simple, clear, true. Elias looked down at his hands. They had a choice, he said. They all had a choice to stay. Ruth nodded. Yes, but you never gave them a reason to stay. Silence again, but this silence was different. It was not empty. It was full. Elias stood up slowly. I never stopped them, he said. That's not the same as welcoming them, Ruth replied. Elias walked a few steps away, then stopped. When you spend your life being told you don't belong, he said quietly, you stop believing anyone will stay, even if they say they will. Ruth listened carefully. You think they were going to leave anyway? She said. Elias gave a small nod. So you never let them get close, Ruth finished. Elias turned back toward her. If they stayed, he said, it had to be their choice, not because I asked. Ruth stood up now. And if they needed you to meet them halfway? She asked. Elias didn't answer. The wind moved softly through the land. The sun was almost gone now. Ruth took a step closer. You didn't test them, she said gently. You pushed them away and waited to see if they would fight through it. Elias's expression tightened slightly. And none of them did, he said. Ruth shook her head. Or maybe they didn't know they were supposed to. That thought stayed between them, quiet, powerful. After a moment, Elias spoke again. Tomorrow is the 7th day, he said. Ruth nodded. I know. Elias looked at her, his voice calm but serious. You don't have to stay. Ruth almost smiled. You've said that without saying it since I arrived, she replied. Elias didn't deny it. Instead, he turned and walked toward the house. Ruth followed. Inside, the house felt different tonight. Not warmer, but clearer, as if something hidden had finally been seen. Elias moved toward a small wooden chest near the wall. He opened it and began placing supplies inside. Food, water, a folded blanket. Ruth watched him. You're preparing for me to leave, she said. Elias nodded once. It's a long road back to town. Ruth crossed her arms. What if I don't leave? Elias paused, just like before, that small pause, but this time it lasted longer. He slowly closed the chest. Everyone says that, he replied. Ruth stepped closer. I'm not saying it, she said. I'm asking you. Elias looked at her, really looked at her, not past her, not through her, at her. What are you asking? He said. Ruth took a breath. I'm asking if you actually want someone to stay. The question changed everything. Elias did not answer right away. His eyes moved slightly, as if searching for something inside himself. Finally, he spoke. I don't know, he said honestly. Ruth nodded slowly. That's the problem, she said. The room fell silent again, but now it felt like something had shifted. A truth had been spoken, and it could not be taken back. That night, Ruth did not read the journal. She didn't need to. She understood now. The ranch was not the reason people left. Elias was not the reason either. It was the space between people, the space where words were not said, where feelings were not shared, where no one reached out first. On the morning of the 7th day, Ruth woke up early. The sky was still pale. The air was cool. She stepped outside and saw Elias near the barn again. The chest was ready. The supplies were packed. Everything was prepared for her to leave. Ruth walked toward him slowly. Her steps were calm. Her mind was clear. Elias turned when he heard her. He didn't speak. He just waited. Ruth stopped in front of him. "This is the day, right?" she said. Elias nodded. Ruth looked at the packed supplies, then back at him. She took a small breath. The seventh day began quietly. The sky was soft and pale, and the wind moved gently across the land. Everything looked the same as the days before, but for Elias, this day had always been different. This was the day they left. Elias stood near the barn, waiting. The supplies were packed, the horse was ready. The road to town stretched long and empty in the distance. He did not rush. He never did. He simply waited, like he always had. Ruth walked toward him slowly. Her steps were calm, her face was steady. There was no confusion in her eyes now. She knew. Elias looked at her. "This is the day," he said quietly. Ruth nodded. "Yes." There was a pause, a familiar one, but this time it felt different. Elias stepped aside slightly, leaving space near the horse. "You can leave whenever you're ready," he said. His voice was calm, not cold, just certain. Ruth didn't move toward the horse. Instead, she stood where she was. Then she looked at the supplies, then back at him. "You've done this before," she said. Elias nodded once. "You prepare everything," Ruth continued. "You make it easy for them to go." Elias didn't answer. Ruth took a step closer. "But you never asked them to stay." Elias's expression changed, just slightly. That small shift again. "I didn't want to force anyone," he said. Ruth shook her head gently. "Asking is not forcing," she replied. The words were simple, but they stayed in the air. Elias looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "People don't stay." Ruth met his gaze. "Or maybe," she said softly, "they were waiting for you to give them a reason to." Silence, but not empty silence, a full one. Elias looked down at the ground, then back at Ruth. "What if I don't know how?" he asked. It was the most honest thing he had said. Ruth's expression softened. "You don't have to know everything," she said. "You just have to try." The wind moved around them, quiet and steady. Elias glanced at the horse, at the road, at the packed supplies, then back at Ruth. "You're still here," he said. Ruth gave a small smile. "I am." Another pause, but this time it was not heavy. It felt like something opening. Elias took a step closer. "You don't feel it?" he asked. "That distance?" Ruth nodded slowly. "I do," she said, "but I also see where it comes from." Elias waited. "It's not the ranch," Ruth explained. "It's not the land. It's not even your past." She looked directly at him. "It's the way you stand just far enough away so no one can reach you." Elias didn't move, but his eyes changed. Ruth took one more step forward. "I can't cross that space alone," she said. "No one can." Elias understood. For the first time, he truly understood. He had been waiting for someone strong enough to stay, but he had never stepped forward himself. The truth settled quietly between them. Elias looked at Ruth. "What happens now?" he asked. Ruth glanced at the supplies, then at the horse, then back at him. She took a breath. "I'm not leaving," she said. The words were simple, but they changed everything. Elias didn't speak right away. He had heard those words before, but this time, they felt different. Because Ruth didn't just say them, she stood by them. "You're choosing to stay?" he asked. Ruth nodded. "Yes." Elias looked at her carefully. "Even if nothing changes?" he asked. Ruth smiled slightly. "Something already has," she said. Elias felt it too. A small shift, quiet, but real. He turned slowly and walked toward the house. Ruth followed. Inside, the house felt different again. Not empty, not silent, just waiting. Elias walked to the end of the hallway, to the closed door. He stood there for a moment, then reached for the handle. Ruth watched quietly. Elias opened the door. Inside, the room was not dark or frightening. It was simple, clean, almost untouched. A room that had never been lived in. "I kept it closed," Elias said quietly, "because I didn't think anyone would stay long enough to use it." Ruth stepped closer. She looked around, then back at him. "It doesn't have to stay empty," she said. Elias nodded slowly. For the first time, he didn't look away. Over the next few days, small changes began. Not big ones, not sudden ones, but real ones. The windows stayed open. The house felt warmer. Meals lasted longer. Conversations grew slowly. Elias still worked hard. Ruth still helped. But now, they shared the space between them, and it didn't feel so wide anymore. Weeks later, Ruth rode into town again. This time, people stared for a different reason. "She's still here. It's been more than 7 days." Ruth simply smiled and continued walking. Back at the ranch, Elias stood outside, watching her return. Not from a distance this time, but waiting near the house. When she reached him, he said, "You came back." Ruth raised an eyebrow playfully. "Of course I did." Elias nodded, and this time, there was no doubt in his eyes. The story of the ranch began to change, no longer about brides who left, but about one who stayed.